Everybody, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome to the final A-side tone engineer, or at least tentatively the final A-side tone engineer, as this is the second to last video in this series that is on the schedule. So had to save a bit of a special occasion for this one, and hopefully this is it, because today we are covering 4 of the most immense and gargantuan album tones that I've been chasing half my life at this point. Catch 33, Nothing re-release, and obZen, all with the Line 6 Vetta II HD. This is Meshuggah, the Vetta 2 years. The timing of this video was kind of accidental, honestly, though I would like to think that I masterminded this particular amplifier being showcased on the same week that the Catch 33 20th anniversary is to be released, even though it's technically closer to the 21st, but I'll let that slide, as well as the 30th anniversary of Destroy, Erase, Improve, which is pretty awesome. So some awesome remasters to listen to here soon. And also, it very much works out as a bookend to the final full year of Plague Scythe Studios, as I've talked about in the recent past. But again, I didn't really architect it that well. It just kind of happened that way. And honestly, maybe it feels like a little bit of destiny or predetermined fate, as this amplifier, or more accurately, modeling device with a power amp, is kind of my white whale in many ways, even though I've dabbled in these tones 1,000 times over the past 10 years on very similar and related devices, or things that are not related whatsoever. This is kind of a meet your heroes moment for me in many ways, and it very much lives up to expectations and at least what I want it to do. It's a bit of a 2 or 3 trick pony for this particular genre of music, but damn, it's a good trick. And this very much is kind of a full circle moment for me, and that makes it special. If you've been with the channel since the very beginning, you might remember that one of my very first videos was covering kind of this era of Meshuggah tone with free VST plugins, trying to cover this sort of modeling tech and that big gent sound without having to spend any money. And of course, over the years, we've gone back to Destroy, Erase, Improve, and Chaos Sphere, None, with the Mesa Boogie years. Kind of more recently, talked about the Pod 2.0, the Pod Pro tones that showed up on the original release of Nothing. And so there's still a few albums to cover, of course, but in terms of the big, monumental, like cornerstone albums for me from this band, who is one of my favorite bands ever, this is kind of the last missing piece of the puzzle. So this is very important for me to encapsulate in a video. And I feel maybe it's only now that I truly have the ear to be able to achieve this stuff on an otherwise kind of antiquated piece of gear at this point, although it still holds up rather well, as I think you'll come to find. Another slight oddity with the Vetta II HD is that I haven't made a video covering this thing on its own yet, honestly, because there's really no need if you reference some of my older catalogs. Usually in a tone engineer, I'm building off of like a Gear Curiosities or an in-depth review that I've already talked about, some of the intricacies or some of the basics of that piece of gear. That way I don't have to be redundant or start from scratch. But with this, I am also not necessarily starting from scratch, because you go way back about 7-ish years ago at this point, I covered every bean-shaped Line 6 pod, and smack dab in the middle of those generations at the time, there's the Pod XT and X3, built off of the same Pod X architecture. And essentially, the Vetta II HD and the Vetta 1 before it are built off of that very same Pod XT DNA. Now, it's kind of interesting because having gone through both of those devices extensively, you can see that this almost slots perfectly in between a Pod XT and a Pod X3, especially the Pro versions of them. The XT has kind of a single signal chain to play around with. You only get, say, one modulation, one delay, one reverb block. You can't really move them around too much. You can a little bit, but not to the point that we're used to with contemporary devices. And then you get to the Pod X3, which essentially gives you 2 signal chains, tone 1 and tone 2, that you can mix together in mono or stereo. You can hard pan one left or right. And this thing kind of acts as a perfect intermediary between the two. You only get one modulation, delay, reverb, comp block, etc., all those typical post effects. But if you go into effect routing, you'll notice right off the bat, you actually get 2 amplifiers to play with. And I think the main driver behind that is that this is a stereo amp. Same thing with the combo equivalent. So you could theoretically have one amplifier tone going through one side of your speaker cab, the other one going through the other side. For today's video, I will be recording direct only. This thing is very capable of that, as there is onboard cab modeling and microphone modeling. But later on in the video, I will definitely be mentioning that matching 4x12 cabinet as it comes up on an album. But prior to the amplifier blocks, you can move around a few stop boxes, and we'll be taking advantage of those for certain. But typically in this video, you will see I'm only sticking to one amplifier. And even if both are on, they're pretty much mirrors of each other. And it's kind of matching the way that, at least as far as I can find, Meshuggah would have used them at the time as well. So long story short, no outboard gear, plugging straight into this thing, going out SPDIF as a digital output, and you're hearing stereo reamps of this thing into some auxiliary digital plugins, and we'll get into the detail of that later. But again, if you've watched the Pod XT or X3 videos, you're going to see a lot of the layouts and stuff are identical. The model selections are identical. I think Pod X3 has a handful of additional Line 6 exclusive amplifiers, but as far as I can tell, all the cabinets and the microphones are present on here, and I think this thing actually has more than the X3 does. Before we can dive into these individual album tones properly, we have to kind of build up a bit of a history here. And I'm going off the cuff, completely from memory of a, like I said, lifetime, or at least half a lifetime of obsessing over this band's discography. So I'm sure I'm going to kind of come off as that Always Sunny meme, but bear with me because I think there's some things that needs to be talked about to clear up any potential confusion before we lay down the groundwork here. So, after Chaosphere was released around 1998, Meshuggah switched from real amplifiers live, maybe not all gigs, but that's where you could start finding recordings of this, especially like Ozfest and some more local Swedish gigs. They switched from their, at the time, iconic dual rectifier rigs to the original red Pod Pro. And seemingly it was just kind of a stand-in for the amplifiers and cabinets. They were still very much using the TC Electronic integrated preamp to boost the thing. They were still kind of in transition of what guitars they were using, going from the Ibanez Universe stuff to the Nevborn 7 strings. But that whole amplifier process sound sort of started on that tour. And as far as I could tell, it even started to replace some of the outboard rack mount gear that Fred would have used, including a Mesa Boogie 50 cal for the lead sounds. Now, this is important because on the next album, Nothing, the orange covered Nothing that released in 2002, they had an insanely tight deadline to record this, and apparently was only recorded in about a month and a half, and mixed in 2 days and mastered in 1. Needless to say, they probably didn't get it exactly the way they wanted it, even though I think it still sounds cool for the time, but they didn't have the gear they wanted, and they certainly didn't have a guitar rig that was up to snuff for the now F standard tuning, down-tuning their existing 7 strings instead of going with a full bass guitar ensemble, as was apparently the original concept. That would have been pretty cool though too. Within a year or so of them touring the Nothing material, they switched from their Nevborn guitars to a custom spec Ibanez M8M, as it would be known later down the road, with a 29.4-inch scale length and the single Lundgren M8 at the bridge position. This kind of became the iconic Meshuggah guitar for the next 20 years, at least some variation of that. Though there was definitely seemingly still some 7-string action with the custom 33 guitar that Fred had commissioned, and you can see that in some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. But primarily on the 8-string tones, that was the foundation of the guitar sound from 2004 onwards. At the same time, the amplifier and effects duties were handed over to the Vetta II HD, which was kind of the new hotness at the time for amplifier modeling, and with the stop box functionality and all the additional blocks and stereo capability compared to some of the more monocentric effects on the Pod Pro original. This was Meshuggah's one-stop shop for all of their guitar and bass tones in the studio and live, and they used this for all the albums pictured until after the obZen tour, maybe even starting with the obZen tour early on when they switched to Axe-Fx Ultras. Would have been kind of interesting to hear what obZen would have been like with Axe-Fx stuff, and definitely wish they would have recorded a Coloss with Axe-Fx, but that's a discussion for another time. For today, though, all of these album tones, including the bass and the rhythm guitar and the lead guitars and the clean guitars and the auxiliary guitars and all that good stuff, is going to be emulated with the Vetta II HD, to the point that you could almost call this the Big Bottom Edition, as that is definitely the star of the show today for the guitar tones, just like the rectifier model was for the Red Pod Pro, but there's a lot of other good stuff in here, and I'm not going to pretend that I know exactly what the signal chain was or that I'm using every single block exactly as they would. A lot of this stuff is simply dialed in by ear, but I think the more important thing is, considering most of you aren't going to be wanting to copy this exactly, is just kind of seeing the strategy here, seeing what types of effects may have been in play, what they sound like. Maybe it's better or worse than the album, up to you, but the real point is the distortion engines on board here are very unique. I'm very glad that Line 6 has continued to keep the big bottom, or the fat bottom, whatever they call it nowadays, on their current devices. It is special, as well as some of the other effects that are on here I think are special too. But you don't have to have this exact device to get a very similar sound. Being the obsessive person I am, especially over Meshuggah, gotta have the real deal though. As I mentioned earlier, I am missing the accompanying 4x12 cabinet that comes with the Vetta II HD. It's loaded with a custom spec of, I think, 70 or 80 watt Celestion speakers. I don't think I would have gotten a whole lot of mileage out of that for this video anyway, but there is confirmation that for one of these albums, that cabinet was used at least in an impulse response capacity, maybe not being recorded live through it, but its imprint tonally is on the album. And I honestly wouldn't be that surprised if it showed up on one of these other albums in impulse response form, or indeed in live form. But like I said, for the most part, we'll be using the direct tones on board with the cabinet and microphone modeling and a little bit of EQ after the fact to get there. For all the guitar recordings, I'll be using my 28-inch NOF custom Super Typhoon as usual, a tad shy of the 29.4 scale length that was used on almost all of the guitar DIs on this collection of albums, except for a couple here and there, as I'll get into later. At least I presume they were not 29.4 in those sections. But most importantly, being the Meshuggah fanboy that I am, this has Lundgren M8s on the bridge and the neck. There's a couple sections in one of these albums especially where I think it sounds like they might have been using a neck pickup, but just to kind of mimic the live recording limitations, I've used the bridge on everything and just kind of messed with the tones to get me there. Tone pot wide open, everything else is basically pure Lundgren tone. And just for extra nerdery, the locking nut and the fine-tuning bridge are the exact same models used on the Stoneman guitars seen since the Violent Sleep of Reason tour. But if you're a Meshuggah tone hunter like I am, you're going to realize that half the sound comes from the bass, not so much the guitar. And it's really a shame that I haven't had a really good opportunity to showcase this instrument since last year, but this is the evil twin to the Super Typhoon, the 5-string version, and it is a phenomenal bass. Oh my God, I love this thing. It plays so nicely. It sounds great too with these custom wound humbuckers that have push-pull capability and a blend pot. This one's also set pretty simply, wide open on both, 50% blend. So that means there's no coil splitting, there's no onboard preamp. All of the sounds, including EQ shaping before the amplifier, it's going to happen on this thing. Now, this isn't the greatest analog to any one individual bass that was used on these albums, or at least the ones that I think were used on these albums, but I think it is a really good compromise of the types of basses that would be used on recording or live. Because in the years surrounding I and Catch 33, Gustav was on his way out or completely out of the band at that point. And even when Dick joined on board, there was no recordings from him until obZen. So a lot of this stuff would either be Martin or Fred, and they were using, as far as I could tell, whatever they had, which was usually some type of bolt-on neck Ibanez bass. And from the images I could find, you might see a soap bar humbucker, you might see kind of a J-bass single coil configuration, but then Dick would play, you know, like Warwick Dolphins live, and he's completely switched brands again. So anything on the bass guitar realm can kind of be EQ'd around, I think, as long as you've got a pretty meaty scale length for the 5-string action, then you're probably going to have a pretty good time. I get great Meshuggah sounds out of my lower end Spectre, so didn't have to use this, but what a good excuse to. Which brings us beautifully into the first section of tones with the bass guitar. I'm going to start with some of these isolated. That way you can just kind of hear the foundation of what the bass is doing in these album mixes. And you'll hear a few sections throughout all of these songs where the guitar is isolated, so you can kind of figure out where one ends and one begins. Now, this aspect of the video was rather tough for me because, one, the information out there, what limited information there is, seemingly pertained more to live presets than it did to what was recorded. So even though I explore that here, it doesn't really help too much for the albums. And two, it didn't really matter how much I nailed the guitar parts on their own. If the bass part isn't right, then they're not going to mesh well and you don't get the full effect. So a lot of this stuff was dialed in by ear, and there's very limited parts in these albums, especially where the bass tone is isolated. So you can't really get a great grasp of it. And in fact, on Catch 33, it's not a real bass guitar at all. I don't know if they even used the Vetta II recording, but that was one of the albums that had electronic drums that was programmed entirely, and apparently the bass was also a VST instrument. So I hear that we're going to try to, recreate that with a real bass, just like the live recording. So on the bass side, especially, this is kind of a blend between what you might hear live and what you would hear in the studio. And in fact, across most of these album sounds, it's the same bass presets just being EQ'd in the mix with the guitars. So I kind of found a happy medium between all of them, and then kind of poked around Catch 33 a little bit differently, since that was the one that sounded the most unique out of all of them. What that culminated in was 3 primary bass guitar patches that I put together using, well, amplifiers that don't really belong to a bass. I do want to start with the oddball, though, that I'll demonstrate by itself. You won't hear it in any of the other album mixes because I was able to find this online. And it's so specific that I think it's true. It's just with my rig and what I like to hear and comparing it to the on-album recordings, it's not my favorite. So one of the limited resources out there that mentions the Vetta II in context of Meshuggah's music is 7string.org, and even then the pickings are slim, but one of the posts lists some very detailed information of what is supposedly the live preset used for the bass guitar around that Catch 33 to obZen era. And most of the settings kind of line up with real parameters in here. There's a couple things that seem a little off to me. It could be firmware differences, it could be miscommunication, misremembering, but it's close enough, and the way I have it dialed in, I could believe it. I think this probably was used at some point, and the way that the mix would have been altered live and the different bass guitar and playing style probably worked out fine. However, much to my surprise, the signal chain starts with a metal zone. Not my first pick for a bass guitar pedal, especially when played with Meshuggah, but as you'll see with some of the other amp selections I made, not off-brand apparently. With these fairly rudimentary settings compared to how I would dial them in on a guitar, but paired with a heaping pile of post-amplifier compression, it kind of works for a bass guitar application. Now, what was more surprising to me was that the amplifier chosen was a completely clean platform, at least in the way that's dialed in, a 73 high watt, 100 watt custom with the matching cabinet, and supposedly the 57 microphone off axis. And that part definitely sticks out compared to what I hear on album and what I ended up selecting for the bass guitar on the other presets. But you use all that together, and again, it's kind of believable. But what I kind of settled on as the cross-album gold standard was the Line 6 Insane amplifier. And it kind of is in the ballpark of the metal zone when it comes to just sheer amounts of distortion, but sculpted in a way that I think sounds a lot more like the recording with my bass guitar pickups. Now, that wasn't without a little bit of sculpting up front with this preamp model, because that is essentially the secret sauce to even the down-tuned 8-string stuff, is having a bit of a boost up front to take care of the distortion texture and the frequencies going into the amplifier. The way that I dialed it in with the bass wasn't actually gain focused at all. It was really to find a cutting, almost honky guitar frequency and push that up quite a bit and push the low end a little bit to stand out against the regular guitar amplifiers. But otherwise, it looks kind of like a guitar amp signal chain because for the most part, it is, just like we saw on the Pod Pro usage on Nothing. Could have used the bass pod, but they got a killer sound out of the guitar amps. The cabinet selection was the 4x12 line 6 model, and the output was set to the U67 microphone, the condenser that most closely, to my ears, matches a lot of the previous like Chaosphere recording sound, and you're going to see that come up many times for the guitars. I also used some generous settings on the 4-band post EQ and the compressor gate, just like the last preset, though it has limited success on this aging platform. However, this preset was only used on 3 of the 4 recordings, and I had to make kind of a separate setup to match the tones of Catch 33, especially that lower gain kind of sound you'll hear in the middle of In Death is Death or Shed, and then kind of made a higher version of that, but pretty simple settings tweaks. And I ended up going with the Line 6 Lunatic amplifier, which seemingly is their version of a hot-rodded 5150 circuit, but a lot of the other elements are going to stay pretty much the same, including the same cabinet and microphone and pretty similar EQ settings and all that. But the amplifier was changed just because I felt like the overall character sounded closer. It was scooped out a bit more like that, whereas the other albums kind of had this big fat mid-focus thing. That one had more of a, I don't know, a cleaner, almost DI mix thing going on, yet a crunchier top end. So I really like this 5150-like amp model for that. What surprised me the most about these bass tones is that I didn't have to rely on the dual amp capability of the Vetta II at all. I was kind of expecting to have to go here to amp 2 and go find, something somewhat clean, but maybe a little fat, and pushed like an SVT and pair that with like the 1x15 cabinet or something more in line with a traditional bass tube amp like Dick would use on recording nowadays. But none of that happened, and it doesn't necessarily need it. So definitely think some of the mixing job for that and the fundamental frequencies of the high quality basses they were using, but just like the Nothing recordings, just like the awesome valve state tones that seemingly showed up on the first couple of albums, you don't really need it. And I think it goes to show that you can use a lot of guitar gear for bass successfully without even needing to split the signal chain. And especially these like cold, solid state, not nice, super digital sounds for guitar work insanely well with bass guitar. Like the insane amp model is such a meme on guitars, but it works like a champ on this thing as a low down like foundation for its distortion engine. So especially by the end, I think a lot of people will have this same philosophy change. But for me, this is almost kind of an inspiration of going, well, who cares, what you use. Even an old Line 6 Insane model from a Spider might do just as good on recording. low end laid down, more accurately, the low end, the low mids, the mids, a little bit of high mids, we can now lay down more lows, just not quite as lows, with the 8-string guitars. And this will get us into the full album sounds and all the presets I used on each one of these. This kind of calls for a spreadsheet, and unfortunately I ran into an issue with this amp before I was able to document some settings, and now when I go to some of the presets that I had recorded, I get this Vetta initial channel glitch, which essentially means that it's out of memory and potentially the onboard battery for the memory needs to be replaced. But I'm not messing with any of that till this video is done because I have a feeling it's going to wipe all the banks, and I don't want that, especially considering that I can't get this thing to communicate over MIDI with my Focusrite interface, and I can't pull the presets from there. But that's a problem for another day. Regardless, I'm going to do my best here to lay out not only each preset that was used on these albums and kind of where they're at, but a master table of all the presets that I made, what the primary effects were, what was on, what was off, and then, kind of use the B-roll in this video to see what they were set to. Again, not in the hopes that you're going to do this exact same thing, but just to kind of see maybe this was in the realm of what was used on an album. And we're going to start with, of course, 2004's I. Being the 20-something minute, seemingly random one-song EP that this is probably my least listened to of the bunch. I've listened to it a lot, don't get me wrong, but I was talking like 50 times compared to 500 of the rest of these albums. And as a result, I've always found it to be kind of incredible as to how much they got right the first time, going directly from the Pod Pros to this was such a giant increase in fidelity and like holy shit sound, especially when it goes into that 4/4 section. But this was definitely the majority of my time spent to learn some of this crap because, good God, the playing is just horrific. Not so much the physical downpicking and everything, or even the individual patterns, even though maybe I didn't play them as cleanly or tightly as on album, but just the patterns are freaking brutal. But you throw that in with some brutal tones and the effect is palpable. As I mentioned earlier, the main star of the show on all these guitar tones is the Line 6 Big Bottom. This is an amplifier model that came stock on the X3, but you had to pay for it on the XT. You had to pay for it again on the HD, and again, it's come stock, as far as I remember, on the Pod, Go, and the associated Helix stuff, as well as the Helix VST plugin stuff, of course. And as far as I can tell, this has always been a rectifier-inspired thing. It even says as much in one of the manuals I remember reading, but I don't know where they're getting all the low end. That it's almost like a sub-harmonic octave generation thing, but it's not. It's just, it's fundamental in there. And it still remains tight in this perfect mixture of the dry gain structure of the rectifier with just a smidge of wet saturation on the top end when you push it enough. It is fucking glorious. I love this amp model. It very much, it plays into my ideal 8-string sound, and I know that's because of this music, but I think they picked the perfect weapon for this job. In that time period, there was nothing else that could have done what this did. And I've said to many people, I hope they just make one day the schematic available for this, because it would be amazing if we could make an all analog version of this, because I bet it would sound even better than what's on board. So there's my nerdy ravings about the Big Bottom. Pushing this with the, once again, Line 6 boost and EQ, just like the bass, but on this one, kind of making it into almost fort and grind type curve, which shouldn't be surprising considering that is a staple of their previous and even future ventures, future in the time frame that this was used. And as such, dialed up the mid gain on a frequency that I found pleasing, absolutely destroyed the incoming bass, kept treble the same, and cranked gain to about 3 o'clock to drive the input of the amplifier. Basic gate was on. EQ, nothing too fancy because realistically, most of the EQ action is going to happen after the fact. This is where things started getting really difficult for me on the guitar side, though, as if all of these albums shared the same rhythm amplifier model, I had to start getting choosy on the cabinet and microphone combinations, with the uncertainty of whether this thing was used direct or not in studio. Now, in live situations, it was pretty clear. There was 3 or 4 of these things rack mounted, and all this stuff was going direct to PA, or at least going to a mixer, and then, you know, the levels and panning were changed depending on who was in a solo and whatnot. But as far as I could tell in studio, there's really no smoking gun as to which cabinet model or microphone model might have been used. And even when I got really close, it was just different enough to where I don't think a simple EQ accounts for the differences. But I think the fundamental frequency responses are there in all of these, you know, kind of comparing the output frequency response to my raw recordings to the album, at least the isolated parts of the album I could find. It's pretty much there. So, you know, if you really want to be dead nuts on all this, and I went through this exercise for fun, you could just use some, you know, curve EQ or ozone EQ match and get it exactly right. That's not really particularly interesting to me. I want to get as close as I can on the source tone and then use some mixing knowledge to get closer to the album to kind of maybe understand their headspace or what was happening in the mix to get it to that point, and maybe prove more and more about how important, you know, that mixing stage is. After a lot of A/B testing between the few sections of isolated guitars that I could find, or at least sections that I had the bass guitar really close, and so the cumulative effect I could kind of tell the difference on. This goes for all the albums. I kind of settled on the 4x12 Brit T75 model for I, and the U67 microphone in the output section. A couple details about this. One, the Brit T75 seems to be the direct replacement for the British 70-watt speaker model that was on the original Pod Pro, featured on the Nothing album. And I guess you could say the V30 mode for the Brit Cab might be that, but sonically, not only does this match the real cabinets better that were used on the earlier albums, but it just kind of has the right amount of thud, the right amount of mid-range saturation, pick attack type accentuation. I'm pretty sure it was this or the real cabinet. I would not be surprised in the least if I was recorded with the real cabinet, because real drums were recorded. They seemingly had more time on that album. So again, I could be convinced either way. What I can almost promise, though, is that if there was a real microphone involved, it was a condenser microphone or a ribbon mic. It definitely does not sound like your typical SM57 or, you know, 421 off-axis type thing, because this microphone model just hits the spot for most of these guitar amp sounds. And that pretty much does the trick for the rhythm tone as it lives on the Vetta II. Now, no matter what I did in the EQ section, I could not get it to sound exactly like the recording. And I knew this would be the case. I knew it wouldn't be 100% like it. But compared to even earlier albums mixes, you can tell you were in the era of really sculpted EQ curves on guitar mixes and the album as a whole. So I kind of pivoted my strategy to do a 2-pass EQ scheme on all these guitars, one in the rhythm guitar section only and one on the master bus, which included the rhythm guitars plus the leads, cleans, and the bass guitar. And I guarantee this is a very simplified, streamlined, not all-encapsulating method compared to what was used on album, but I think it does a pretty good job at the 80/20 in terms of effect versus effort. So the first thing I did was sculpt the Vetta II just by itself, basically taking the common denominator of all 4 rhythm guitar tones and kind of going, what is this missing across all these albums, or what seems to be happening? And some of that was just by ear. Some of it I used an EQ match tool and then EQ'd by hand to get close to that EQ match. After disabling it, of course. And then after I kind of had a baseline guitar amp sound mixed for all of them, then I went to the master bus and added a different EQ for each album. So there's one for I, there's one for Catch 33, there's one for Nothing Remastered, and there's one for obZen. And so those 2 EQs stacked, plus this rhythm sound, is what you're hearing for all of these recordings. And I think that's probably close to what actually happened for the rhythm guitars, if not 3 or 4 more passes of EQ plus compression limiting and all that stuff. But that very much is the methodology that I think you kind of have to use for a digital modeling amp of this era. Now, you could probably pair it with more ready to mix impulse responses and get closer, but that's just kind of the nature of the beast for the types of amps here. Another critical caveat, all of these albums, as far as I can tell, were quad tracked. I can promise you that nothing remastered was, but it seems to have the same kind of, not phasiness, but thickness across all these productions that make me very confident that at least 4 guitars were involved on all the rhythm stuff. For all but one section, I'm going to just dual track. So 1 hard pan left, 1 hard pan right, plus the bass. With how much work the tracking was on this thing, and with how complex some of these rhythms are, I'm not about to go the full quad tracking route. And I would say a lot of people out there wouldn't be able to discern the difference between the quad track tone versus the just pure single track amplifier tone, because I have a hard time doing it. I will quad track in one section, not for this I song, but for some of the future material. But with that said, don't be surprised if this doesn't sound quite as thick or produced as a result, even if the output frequency response is pretty close, in my opinion. Now, this is when we start getting into the leads, cleans, other accompaniments for I in particular. It's not too far removed from the type of sound you would have heard on the original Nothing Pod Pro preset. In fact, I chose something very similar, the Line 6 tread plate, because I felt like that had the right amount of mids, the right distortion texture. It still kind of sounded digital, didn't have any one particular Mesa Boogie characteristic of like, that's definitely a, Rev G, or that's, more of a Mark series thing. It just kind of blends all that distortion together, and I think it works. As for the post effects, looking at stereo delay here, I again couldn't rule out that some of the outboard rack gear that Fred had used prior to this was in use. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but that kind of stuff definitely isn't available on here when it comes to multi-tap delay. But stereo sounds pretty good, and you mix it with a little bit of modulation with the U vibe dialed in, relatively low compared to how I would normally use a vibe type effect. We're down below like 25% here. It gives you kind of a modulated delay sound. That brings us to the one-tempo wonder, Catch 33, arguably the godfather of all gent-thal, down-tuned 9-10 string madness genres out there, even more so than I. But if there's one album that I had to bet on the most confidently of being recorded direct, as in no cabinet involved, it's probably going to be this one. Because if we know the drums were programmed, if you know the bass guitar was programmed, why would you go through the trouble of miking up a cabinet when this thing has all the direct features? And it also sticks out the most to me, frequency response wise. It has the most MIDI, less thumpy guitar tone. It still sounds great, but it also sounds the most to me like their live renditions. When you look up some of these videos from that time, they're pretty much the same as far as their direct signal path goes and the way that it sits in the mix live. So I would bet that basically they took their studio tone and made a couple tweaks and that was it. The question is what cabs were in use, or at least what did it sound like on recording? Now, same basic line 6 big bottom type signal chain, although I did add a little bit of graphic EQ in there to pronounce those high mids and lower mids as I hear them on the album. But the really big difference is the cab model being a greenback equipped 4x12, still once again using the U67 microphone model. And I think this kind of makes sense given the overall tonal difference between this and I, that if they were going to go direct and they use something, even if it wasn't this cab impulse response, it does kind of fit with my experience of a lot of these amp modelers being pushed in the mid-range to make them sound better, as well as kind of hide some of the deficiencies of the modeling at that time. And even if that's not what happened, I feel like this has a good difference in frequency output compared to the other cab models, while still being sort of on brand for Meshuggah. I know they don't dislike greenbacks by any means. There's several sections in Catch 33 where there's basically a lower gain version of the rhythm sound. It's mixed the same. It sounds basically identical. It's just literally lower gain. So you can accomplish that in a couple ways. I think I've turned down the amplifier drive in addition to turning down the output gain on the input boost, but otherwise basically the same signal chain. There's a hell of a lot of other stuff going on though. Multiple leads, though basically the same format as the I leads. I do play around with the modulation and delay every now and again, but in this instance, stereo delay, univibe again for the modulation and delay controls, also keeping with the tread plate cabinet and of course the U67 microphone. There are multiple lead sounds throughout that album, and again, one of them kind of has that neck pickup, like dull type thing going on. I did try to recreate that with using just a bridge pickup for potential live use, but really all the other effects are pretty much the same. I did end up adding a fuzz face though, which kind of seems like that can't be right for Meshuggah, and I don't know that it is. In fact, I would almost bet that it's not, but if they're willing to use a Metal Zone model live, then I think that throws out all conventions about what we think we know about what they would typically use. But I can almost promise you there was some sort of additional distortion effect or some dulling type of effect on some of the rhythm stuff, especially in that midsection of In Death is Death. So this kind of fits. It kind of has that rippy Velcro texture that you hear on that aforementioned lead part, and I liked it. Just when I thought I was starting to get this whole thing figured out, I arrived to the clean sounds on Catch 33, or the cleanish sounds as it goes for many of the tones. This one's tough because Catch 33 is an oddball when it comes to many of those interlude sections or what's playing over top of the rhythm sections. And in the past, and even on more future albums from Catch 33, it was kind of obvious as to what was going on. It was fairly well documented during the, say, Destroy, Erase, Improve days, where Martin have like an outboard unit that basically bypasses amps, or at least the preamp entirely, and you got almost like a crystal clean, no preamp tube stuff involved at all, just big compression, modulation, some delay reverb type sounds, and I was able to recreate that quite well actually with a Digitech Studio Quad V2, and I would assume the Pod Pro had pretty similar preset capability there, using just like the regular tube preamp and some modulation. So I kind of started there, and I think for some of the plain Jane clean tones, that works perfectly. But they're not all plain. You get some weird panning stuff, you get that weird dull, section that I mentioned a moment ago. And the bigger problem for me is that this isn't just as simple as a Pod Pro of turning off the cab modeling, or air modeling as it's referred to, as if you turn off the cab, you would expect there to be no microphone modeling. So I didn't pay much attention to this at first, and leaving this on U67, it gives you good results. But I noticed later down the road that if you start scrolling through microphone models, you will actually change the tone. That makes no sense, right? How are you having a microphone imprint on something that's not playing through a cabinet? Obviously, they're just stacking EQ effects on top of one another or something akin to an impulse response. But that is all to say that having microphone on still affects the sound. If you go over here to the output setup and change your config from 4x12 to 2x12, thinking this was only affecting the output of the power amplifier, you get a different sound. So I don't know exactly in a block diagram view of this how all this plays together, but for all of these tones, I kept it at 4x12 config in the output setup file, and depending on which album I was playing with, sometimes I put a cab model there and then no mic. But if you do that, it sounds like there's no cab. It kind of sounds like maybe, and I highly doubt this, but maybe that cabinet is kind of interfacing with the transformers and the speaker impedance interaction of the power amplifier, so you kind of get that bump. I highly doubt it. I think honestly that is just kind of baked in somewhere, and this is adding maybe a high kind of roll off and a big resonant bump to fake it. And then the microphone, when in combination with that, is kind of closer to your impulse response thing. So I don't really know, to be honest with you. What I do know is that tube preamp plus a microphone doesn't quite sound like it has a full cabinet IR sound baked in, but it also doesn't sound completely naked either. So it sounds good. It sounds like how you would want a super clean guitar tone to work out to be. For a lot of the clean stuff, I'm keeping the booster on, though playing with the frequency output. Still low bass, but not completely cut. I'm still boosting the mids a little bit, but actually had to roll off some of the treble because a lot of this stuff does have like bright clips or bright caps rather that are not clipped that will kind of drive the input of the preamp too hard. So kind of controlling that there. Little bit of EQ work there, nothing too crazy. Modulation, once again, like in the Univibe at subtle settings, and stereo delay. So kind of taking the lead format and just lowering the amplifier gain and kind of getting rid of some of the cabinet tones. It's not quite as simple though when you go to the second lead tones and second clean tones. On the second version of what I'm calling clean, which is not clean at all, we're looking at that fuzz face returning, which is kind of weird, but again, I feel like it adds that right level of dullness and without being tube distortion. It's certainly not tight. It almost doesn't even register as distortion to me. It's just kind of like a textural difference. But I did keep the Line 6 Boost EQ on because I was able to roll off the treble to add to that dull effect. In that section, it also sounds like there's some panning stuff going on in lockstep with the tempo, so I made the amp do it instead of having to do it in post. Delay, still stereo delay with some different offsets between each channel, but this time I added some reverb. I like the War Memorial here. Again, this stuff could have been added in post in a plugin. Who knows if this was on the amplifier itself, but that's what I arrived at for that weird interlude section.
Meshuggah continued their yearly album release spree with Nothing. Again, this time blue, or I should say remaster Nothing, Nothing re-release, whatever you want to differentiate it as. This was the second attempt at this album because as much as many of us love the original release, as I said, it was kind of rushed, and I know I wouldn't have been happy with having 2 days to make something, a day to master it, and you can definitely hear that those guitars are a little loose, not quite up to snuff for the job. So since the productions of I and Catch 33 were long scale 8-string, exactly the pickup they wanted, amazing amplifier tones, they wanted to redo their first attempt at 8-string music. And in basically every measurable way, it's better when it comes to the end result. But I do find I miss the real drums. I do miss the kind of cleaner production on the vocals. And it's hard for me to choose. I kind of wish there was a third version, or at least all the raw stems were out there. Even like on Meshuggah's website of like, hey, do you want to hear the new guitars with the old vocals and old drums? Do you want to hear, and that would be cool as hell. But the one thing that is really interesting to me is that a lot of the stuff was reused on Nothing. Starting with the vocals, it's the same performance, just a lot more of that contemporary, like post-distortion stuff. And I wish they would have dialed it back a little bit, but it fits the vibe. But when it comes to the bass guitar, and from my ears, seems like the leads, cleans, all of that were the original recordings. That means we're probably hearing 6 or 7-string guitars on many of the clean and lead sections. That means you're hearing a Pod Pro on those sections instead of the Vetta II. That means the bass guitar that was recorded was also through a Pod Pro or something else entirely. So this one's odd because as influential as this amplifier is for that era, it really is only appearing on the new rhythm guitar tones. And then you've got programmed, re-sampled drums and the vocals to complete that whole package. So this one was a tough decision for me. Do I go back and whip the pod out again like I did on the previous one, or do I just say, the hell with it, let's try to get it with the Vetta II? And I did the latter because, well, I kind of already know the answer on Pod Pro. So I wanted to see how close can we get to those sounds on the leads and the bass guitar, because obviously they would be playing that material live with this stuff. So it's not like they could just throw that out entirely. They had to kind of match that work. And it's really so close in terms of what they would have used anyway that I think 90% of people would not even be able to tell if you switch between the two live, because using those aforementioned models for leads and cleans, or at least the closest ones to those, basically the same. Unsurprisingly, the foundation for the rhythm guitar amplifier is, you guessed it, the big bottom, boosted by the Line 6 boost and EQ. Pretty similar settings at that as well to the other albums. EQ on the high end, but nothing really dramatic. Some of the mids around 950 to 1000 hertz. But the thing that really started making me pull my hair out
was what cabinet model to use, because this is another instance where I'm thinking, if you're going to reuse tracks from the last recordings, would you really go through the effort of miking this type of setup up to get a new recording? And the short answer is I don't think so, but it wouldn't surprise me if what we hear on Nothing re-release is an impulse response, because it's close as this is, and it sounds really good in the mix. Even if you play along to the album, it's like, yep, that's definitely in the ballpark. This Line 6 cabinet plus the U67 mic is just not quite there. And even with post EQ, as close as it is, it still would not shock me if there was an impulse response used, because this was right around the time when, it wasn't completely crazy to use an impulse response, even though you probably had to have a dedicated loader for it live. And some people have apparently seen Meshuggah and said that they had a rack unit that could do that, or reverb, but they think they were using IRs at that point. So maybe that's the case here. If not, this combo is really close. For the leads and cleans, I essentially started with models that were already on Pod Pro, or ones that were close to what I think was used on Pod Pro, and adjusted from there just to get it to mix well with the rhythm guitars and bass. For one of the leads, still looking at the same basic boosted rectifier or tread plate model. On the modulation and delay side, I didn't really change much on delay, stereo delay once again, but I like the random chorus here. Something about that kind of has that robotic tapping spider-like lead thing. It just works well with that playing style, especially the tap stuff. But to separate it from the rhythm guitar amps a little more and kind of accentuate a lower fidelity mid-hump type of sound, I selected the Brit V30 cabinet this time, and the U67 microphone off-axis. Again, still kind of fitting the overall mix, but just something a little different, and shifting the frequency response a little more to sound like it pokes out better from the rhythm amps. Another section that I've erroneously named as C for clean. It's really not super high gain, but it kind of plays some notes that almost sound clean in the mix until you hear it by itself. A pretty similar overall methodology, random chorus, once again, fairly similar settings, locked in with the tempo at the time, stereo delay again, and of course the boosted EQ controls. But some of this stuff was just dialed back on the gain and mixed a little differently. For what was actually the true clean sounds, though, these are fairly similar between the two, but I did find that I needed two slightly different variations to get that closed eye visuals interlude sound. And this is very much going off of the same Catch 33 idea, where you go with a clean tube preamp, sculpted a bit in the front, and once again I selected no cabinet this time. To compensate for the master EQ I'm using, I selected the U67 off-axis instead. It kind of sorts out some of those more fizzle-like frequencies for you, but otherwise pretty dang close to what you might hear on the Pod Pro, and it also kind of separates itself a little better from my other clean preset, which used the regular U67. So this gives a little better separation. As far as the other effects are concerned, back to random chorus, stereo delay, and reverb is Hangar 18. Gee, I wonder what they could be possibly referencing with that one. But this is the kind of stuff that in that ambient section, or that song, and a lot of ambient sections in all these albums, who really knows? Was outboard gear involved? Were they slapping some more plugins on top of it? A lot of this stuff is pre-recorded, even when it's played live. Not all of it, but some of it is. And so it makes you question, like, if they're choosing not to play that section, either because there's too many layers or because it sounds so different, what was the limitation in studio, or what were they using that limits them live? Finally, we have 2008's obZen, the first with Dick Lovegren playing on bass, apparently. And this one's a bit of a controversial mix amongst fans. There are some that, obviously lament that Bleed got too mainstream, or, some of these other songs aren't as killer as some of the stuff from Nothing Catch 33. But I think the biggest point of controversy for people is, at least the ones that care, is the mix. And I definitely agree that it is subpar in many ways compared to the previous albums. Not that I think it's bad, or not that I don't think it sounds great in isolation, or that it doesn't even, fits the music really well. When I see that album cover and I hear those tones, it's like they're married somehow to me in my head. They do fit very well. It's kind of cold and not quite sterile, but I don't know. There is some type of earworm in that frequency response that I can see why it gets grating for some people. But there's no doubt that it fits great in many ways. And the remaster for its 15th year anniversary in the past couple of years, I think did a lot to improve it. Though in some aspects, I still do prefer the ERMZ attempts at remasters a little bit, but it's an improvement no matter what. So I do appreciate that. And I think a lot of the oddity had to come down to the fact that, one, the bass guitar really wasn't in much bass guitar frequencies at all, even compared to the bass guitars that were very much in guitar frequencies in the previous ones. It kind of, I think, jumped the shark a little bit there. Been nice if they'd bi-amped or something, but also because it sounds like this is where the impulse response came into play on the guitar amp side of things. And this one's pretty much confirmed, because looking online, Jacques Skog himself said, yes, I shot an impulse response of that Line 6 Vetta II HD cab with some knockoff Chinese ribbon microphone, no name thing. In fact, you can get your own custom plate on it if you order enough. And that is the core impulse response used for obZen. And it does make me think, well, if he was involved there, maybe he was involved on Nothing re-release, but I don't know for sure. As a result, though, my other basic rhythm amplifier signal chain is pretty close down to the same boost EQ and amplifier selection, the cabinet and microphones basically turned off, with the mic being set to off and keeping the cab on the Line 6 4x12, because, like I said, this still has some frequency response feedback, kind of giving it a big boomy low end, just like you'd see in the resonance of a speaker response curve. But without that mic being turned on, you essentially get a DI amplifier type sound that needs a cabinet. Now, therein lies the problem, right? How do we possibly get the impulse response from an album that no one has, or that's not been sold, or anything? So there's a few strategies, one of which is you could export some of the tone match stuff that people have out there if they're willing to share. But the more accurate thing to do, in my opinion, given the fact that I don't have the real cabinet, is to go find an impulse response of that cabinet. It's like, who the hell would bother doing that? I mean, I did find back in the day a free version of the Vetta II combo, and that's really nice of these people to make this stuff. But, it's like, that's not it. It's a 2x12 isn't the same thing. But lo and behold, I found an old Clawfinger folder in my free impulse response collection that I've been hoarding for half my lifetime. Clawfinger, of course, being Jacques Skog, and in there is a Vetta II 4x12 cabinet shot with that exact microphone. At least the character string matches the first bit of that microphone's model name. It has to be this one. At least this has to be in the same session or something to that effect as this actual cabinet IR. So I'm using that as the bass for, not the bass guitar, the basis of my cab sound for the rhythm tone on obZen and the accompanying guitar stuff. It still needs some work. It's not perfect, and some of the changes, I think, almost certainly were not just, simple EQ tricks. I do think it was probably in a different position or something compared to, what the album uses. Might have been one that they didn't end up using, hence it ended up in some guy's, link Dropbox that I got forever ago, and I couldn't even tell you where that came from. But it's sort of a thinner type cabinet sound. It very much sounds OEM speaker, as in it doesn't have any one particular hallmark of a T75 or a V30. It's just kind of a blend, and it works. It's just, I wish they would have done something different personally. You know, put this thing on a Marshall 4x12 and record that the old way, like on Chaos Sphere or Destroy Erase Improve. That would have been awesome. Regardless, with what we got, I made the best of it. And when you go over to the lead sound, as a result, or the clean sound, you're going to see still have the microphone turned off. Now, for the lead, this is when I had to start getting a little more creative on my modulation and delay choice. This one's still using stereo delay, separated on that offset again. But a lot of these leads have like I don't know, a really throaty type thing going on. And if I understand correctly, he was using, Fred that is, he was using one of those magnetic string resonator things where you get no decay. It's like an infinite hold on that note. And it sounds really cool for songs like Bleed or the background of Dancers. But obviously I don't have one of those. And there was still like this almost auto wah type thing going on, or at least the throatiness and vocal type characteristic of that guitar still came through. So I like the lumpy phase to be able to do that on, and it really works well with eighth note picking or held long notes. So I'm going to use that on at least this lead and some other background playing that essentially shared the same signal chain with just some EQ differences, some minor stuff, just to get it to sit the way it sounded to me in the song. The clean part was like, man, this is cool. This was one of those capstone moments for me where I've always played that part in Bleed with, you know, playing the notes twice to make it sound like it was resonating the same way. But for this occasion, I had to dial it in the way I think it actually is. I found this low res delay, and dialing up the mix really high and the feedback past 50%, you get that second note playing at almost the same intensity as the first one, and it sounds really cool and haunting. Also had to add in the Hangar 18 reverb again, just for some more ambiance and having that held out longer. Some big compressions, 6.0 to 1 there, but didn't even need a stomp box to boost this tube preamplifier sound. It just was right out of the gate. Even though I was surprised that there wasn't more stereo spread, or at least in terms of the way it sounds on album to me. In my head, it always had more of a ping pong effect, but it really doesn't. I'd say there was some spatial stuff being manipulated on the master, though, that kind of gives it a wider spread than maybe I'm giving it. But that basically is the formula to obZen as far as I can tell. with that, we come to the end of our tone matching, or at least getting it as close as I can get it, journey of the Line 6 Vetta II HD. And if you've sat through this long, I assume you don't mind if I nerd out for another 10 or so minutes, because I mean, what's another 10 minutes on top of an hour and 45 run time or whatever this ends up being. Videos like this don't prove I'm on the spectrum somewhere, then nothing will. So this amplifier, this whole era of digital amp modeling is, I think, now more appreciated than it used to be. There were bands that were just all over this stuff and making some of my favorite sounding albums. So some of it to the point that I knew it was fake, but I loved it for that. But in a lot of ways, I feel like we've lost something going away from this, not so much in the modeling department. I mean, like Axe Effects is better than it's ever been. It is, as I proved in the shootout that I did. You don't really need real tube amplifiers anymore. But what I do love about this is it kind of leans into the fakeness sometimes. And because of that, just like with the original Pod Pro, I kind of find some of these amp models to be like irreplaceable. Nothing else does that stuff. And because I know it's so fake to begin with, and you don't really worry about the solid state versus tube regime so much, because neither one of them are really modeled true to life anyway, then it just becomes its own thing. And you don't really think about, oh, well, this isn't a signal chain I would be able to replicate in real life, because you're not even thinking about those constraints. You're not looking at a drive pedal with those same controls. It's like, what kind of sound can I make? And I do really like that for it. Now, I certainly recognize that after I had reviewed the Pod X3, XT, and even the HD, but for a while I'd kept the X3, but just the interface of it, I didn't like it at all. Even though I had some presets that I did enjoy, the simplicity of the Pod Bean and the original Pod Pro rack are why I've kept them, despite them being, kind of obsolete in many ways. They still do some really cool stuff. And I feel like this is the perfect form factor for this era of Line 6. I do not like the XT. I especially hate the fact that you had to buy all the expansions and stuff. And I don't really like the X3 Bean, because it's too much for its own good in that form factor, even though it sounds fine. Sounds the same as this, as you would imagine, except for those cab models. But when it comes to the information that's available to you and the interface that displays all that stuff, this is pretty slick. It at first looks like overkill, because, especially first getting this thing in here, I'm like, holy shit. I knew there was a bunch of buttons, but I didn't realize there was like something for every screen. And so at first, your brain's thinking, oh my God, this is going to be a sub-menu nightmare. But it's not. The reason there's so many buttons is because it goes back to that pod simplistic interface type of mentality where every button does one thing, and that's it. I mean, every button takes you to that screen, and you've got multiple pages, usually. But once I got a kind of a feel for this, I miss this kind of stuff. And I certainly wouldn't mind if there was a simplified, Axe Effects head that did this, where, still hook it up to a computer, get into all the, the really complex speaker pages and all that. But for a lot of people, there's still some appeal here. It's kind of why I liked the interface of the Kemper in a lot of ways. But to be honest with you, I'd rather use this than the Kemper when it comes to the interface. And I don't plan to ever use this as a real amplifier, even though it can be used that way. But it would be pretty cool to have this as, the centerpiece of selecting between the pod and the, anything else I wanted to in the loop, and bypass the rest of the stuff, as you basically can if you just go to the tube preamp or select none of the cabinets or effects and things like that. But even if I don't use it in that way ever, it's still, I think, the right interface for this generation of modeling. Like I said, it kind of answers a question and something I've been wondering for a long time when it comes to this era of Meshuggah tone. It's like, did they make the right choice? Why didn't they just do a XT Pro like everybody else, or wait on the X3? And I get it now, I think, because this was right at the correct time. It did just a little bit more than the XT, and the interface is pretty spectacular for what it does. It looks nice. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe this is 20 years old. I can believe it in many ways, but what a gigantic step up from the Pod Pro compared to you know, where they were at the time. I can see this thing feeling like a spaceship. So long story short, I wasn't sure if I was going to keep this thing afterwards because it's like, well, where do you stop? Where do you draw the line if I'm going to be collecting the Meshuggah gear that was used on album? Do I, you know, stop at the 50 caliber and the old rectifier and this, that, and the other? And that's a problem for the future, of course. But for now, I like it well enough and I appreciate the form factor that I think I am going to hang on to it. There's stuff that I could use it for, but most importantly, I feel like the tones and the joy of using it justifies its existence in a way that it didn't on previous pods, and definitely doesn't on the HD era for me. There's not a single form factor of that amp that I think I would really like. Maybe that one HD 147 amp head or something, but there's no formidable albums using that I know of, so probably not. The main reason I wasn't sure about even acquiring this thing, let alone keeping it though, is because this is, like I said, very much a meet your heroes moment, but at the same time, it was kind of the era of it's a tone, and I want to know how to get that tone or work my way into dissecting it and recreating it, but not necessarily needing the real thing to do it. And Meshuggah very much defines that as a band to me. You know, just because they use this, that doesn't mean they couldn't have used something else at the time. And they switched to the Axe effects soon after, then Ultra, went back to real tube heads, going back and forth between modeling and that. So, you know, between that and using a freaking VST plugin stock amp sim that comes with Cubase on one album, they're not gear obsessed in that way. And I wanted it to be that, you know, that same way. I wanted to have that same mentality, especially when starting this YouTube channel. But I think there are times when it's okay to admit it's just like, I freaking want it, and it does a really good job. And so I'm glad I was able to make this as a result. But this amp head and this video in general really encapsulates why this era of music and why this band is so important to me on a creative and a personal level. They are the reason, these albums especially, are the reason I wanted to do this kind of stuff. Sure, there's plenty of bands I'm a huge fan of. I'm, you know, Metallica nut, Black Sabbath nut, but these albums, especially, you know, Catch 33, especially Nothing, I mean, these are right up there, in my opinion, to some of the most important metal albums of all time, some of the most important music of all time. Obviously, I have a skewed perspective on that, but it's as important as Paranoid, as Master of Puppets to me, because this stuff, you can hear the echoes of it 20 years later, and unlike a lot of the music that I just mentioned, 20 years from that time, it doesn't really sound like it's aged at all. And that's a bit of a slippery slope because people will say that about like a motorcycle or a car and be like, that thing could just, you know, have a fresh coat of paint, be brand new on the lot today. No one would tell the difference. Maybe put some bigger rims on it. And most of the time that's not accurate, because it's not that that thing looks old or like terrible, but it's like, you know, headlight designs have changed. Safety stuff has changed. So really, it's not that it looks old, it just doesn't look new, because the new stuff has all these features and design elements that, you know, you can tell it was made after 2020. But it's kind of the same thing with music for me, where Meshuggah does not sound old. I mean, they've always sounded 20 years ahead of their time. And I think you listen back to, you know, None, Destroy, Erase, Improve, it's the same thing. To me, they just don't have the almost cliche new type stuff going on when it comes to the samples that are being used or the overcompression. But as far as heaviness and just brutality goes, this stuff is still crazier than most shit coming out nowadays. While the tuning and the rhythmic foundations and hell, even the samples used on some of these albums have been built upon and, you know, kind of sound standard as a result, none of that would happen without these guys, and they've still done it the best as far as I'm concerned. And it's to the point that when I think of heavy 8-string music, even 7-string music, 9-string music, I cannot get these sounds out of my head. This is the gold freaking standard as far as I'm concerned. And obZen, as many problems people have with the mix, is still 95% there, because this was the first album that I got in full from Meshuggah, and at 13 years old, I was like fucking mind blown as to what I was hearing. I'd heard, you know, Future Breed Machine and some of the singles off that. I'd heard some Chaos Fear stuff, and I loved that. I was like, this is really cool, but that was kind of almost in the regime of Sepultura and older bands to me. And then I heard this, and I'm like, what have I been missing? And then of course I was introduced to nothing, and then went back and listened to these, like, oh my God, I don't care about anything else anymore. I just need to learn this stuff. And in many ways, that release in 2008 and the steps between there and 2017 is what inspired me to do this. It was the catalyst for me trying to figure out, how did these guys get this freaking tone? And not so much about, okay, I can go out and buy this piece of gear, but what are those individual elements and how can you get that using the stuff I already have? Because I'm, in high school, I don't have $3,000 to drop on, the guitar, the amplifier, and all that stuff. And I want to be able to use what I have right now. And so this is so monumentally important to me from a creative standpoint that words just can't do it justice. And personally, I mean, all these albums have accompanied thousands, tens of thousands of miles of road trips and to and from jobs or school, and studying hours, and held on the way to and from Meshuggah concerts. And it's just like a soundtrack of life to me. And on a personal level, it's so primal, it's so stripped down, but it is so fundamental to what I think heavy music should be, that I cannot help but use them as the number one inspiration musically when I write my own stuff on 8-string. It's inevitable, right? I mean, I have no qualms about admitting that they're my heroes when it comes to that stuff. You can hear it in Cedarham, you can hear it in Elatria, and even though I'm not playing the exact same tones, the exact same production, a lot of the tricks I learned from them, and I put my own spin on them, as I hope everybody else does. But I cannot overstate how important these albums in particular are. I mean, their whole discography is, but as Pantera is to Ola England, Meshuggah is to me. For me, they're the greatest of all time. And this was as much of a celebration of the albums and these insane masterpieces as it was for me just to actually figure out what they did, putting it down on recording. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this and got some useful information out of it. If you're interested in the Vetta II HD, good luck. They're getting harder and harder to come by, more expensive than I wanted to pay. But if you can't find one, hopefully you've enjoyed this little kind of big exploration into the capabilities of the Vetta II, celebration of mid-2000s Meshuggah. And next time on Tone Engineer, tentatively the last one, like I said, because good God, I don't know how I'm going to top this one. We'll be looking into hopefully more pedal-centric tones. So with that, any other questions or comments, please leave them down below. As always, thank you so very much for sticking around to the end. See you next time. Bye.